And now we can jump into variation, more microevolution stuff. So sources of variation. So the different things, we already talked about variation as far as being something that's essential for natural selection and evolution to occur. Different sources of variation in a population, if you think about it, are going to be mutation. Okay, so changes in the DNA can certainly lead to variation. That's how we get a lot of really great adaptations, because for sure, not all mutations are bad. Sexual reproduction. Thank goodness for sexual reproduction, because it creates a ton of variation. If you think about it, you are not a carbon copy of either of your parents, right? Because we have, during the process of meiosis, which you may have covered in an intro bio class, we have independent assortments of our chromosomes during the production of egg and sperm. So you have this blend in an egg and this blend in a sperm that are coming together and creating something that's completely and entirely unique. So there's a 1 in 8 million chance that the same two people can produce the same child, okay? 1 in 8 million. So it's not gonna happen. There's that much variation just amongst two individuals. Okay, so it is a crazy and wonderful thing that contributes variation to this world. Another thing that's really awesome is this idea of diploidy, meaning that we are diploids. We have two versions of every single chromosome. We have two versions of every single gene that we have, which is super important because it allows us to have this thing called heterozygote advantage. So if you've taken any sort of genetics prereq or anything like that in a freshman bio class, then you know that you can be homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. And if you're heterozygous, you have two versions of that trait. The last one is outbreeding. We breed with people that are different than us. You can't breed with someone too closely related to you. It's not good for variation. And so you breed with people that aren't identical to you, and that creates even more variation. So all of these things, that some of them seem like really simple, you might not think about them, they're really, really important. And it's something good to have written down, just because you might be asked about sources of variation within a population, just because it is fundamental to allowing evolution to occur. Okay, so heterozygote advantage means that being heterozygous, so first and foremost, if you haven't taken any sort of intro bio and you're not super familiar with what it means to be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive, you have two versions of a gene called alleles that make you what you are, one from mom and one from dad. And because of that, in a very simple sense, you can have two dominant alleles, and we call them dominant just because they usually produce a protein that overpowers whatever protein the recessive allele is making. So you can have two dominant alleles, and then we call you homozygous dominant, homo meaning same, and then dominant meaning that you have those two alleles. You could have a dominant and a recessive allele like we see in that middle picture there, which means that you have one of those dominant protein producing genes and one that is not producing as much protein or any at all. And then we call you a heterozygote, hetero meaning different. And then lastly, all the way on the right, you can be homozygous recessive, homo again meaning same, recessive meaning that you have two versions of that gene that we would consider recessive, either because they're producing less or no protein is usually how that works, okay? So whenever we're talking about genes or alleles, just remember that it's DNA that's going to turn into some sort of usable protein. So what you'll see here, well, you need to know a little background on what sickle cell anemia is and what malaria is. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder that's inherited, so you can pass it down to your offspring. And if you are homozygous recessive, so if you get two recessive versions of a gene, okay, that would be you all the way on the right. We have that as two lowercase a's because we use lowercase letters to represent recessive. Then you have your blood cells actually look like these curved sickles. Like if you think about what the Grim Reaper holds, meant for farmers, but that's a sickle, okay? So it's like a hook or a moon shape, which is not the normal shape of your blood cells. So if you know anything about your red blood cells, you'll know that they carry oxygen for you. And so having red blood cells that look like a hook instead of like a nice big circle is going to be a problem for you. And so actually most of the people who do have sickle cell anemia, especially in countries where it's more common, will pass away from that. It can be fatal at kind of a young age. Okay. On the left-hand side of the spectrum, if you are a fully healthy homozygous dominant, meaning that you got 2 strong copies of that gene for blood cell production, then you have nice round happy blood cells and you can carry lots of oxygen just fine. And then in the middle, if you're heterozygous, you have some genes that are making those nice round plump blood cells for you. And then you have that one gene, that lowercase a, that's actually providing some of those sickle-shaped blood cells. Okay? So you have a mix, and that's a good way to think about what homozygous dominant versus heterozygous versus homozygous recessive is, just by looking at this graphic and noticing that the middle is a mix of the two. So where this comes into play is in areas such as Africa, where both sickle cell anemia and the disorder malaria are very common. So malaria is a disorder that's carried by mosquitoes that when you're bitten with it, the parasite actually infects your red blood cells. And then it travels and it stays throughout your body and it can make you really, really sick. Well, the thing is, if your blood cells aren't round, right? So remember, if you're healthy, your blood cells are round and plump. If your blood cells are sickled, the parasite actually can't enter that cell. It can't attach and it can't get inside of that cell. So if you have those sickled cells, you're actually protected from getting malaria, or you're just getting a very mild version of it. So on the right-hand side of the spectrum, if you're homozygous recessive for sickle cell disease, you're probably going to pass away at a young age from this disease. If you're on the left-hand side and you have these nice plump blood cells, but you live in an area such as Africa where malaria is very common, you can get infected with malaria and potentially pass away from that as well. But then in the middle, we hit kind of this advantageous spot, being a heterozygote, where not only are you not really showing your sickle cell disease, but you're also incapable of being infected with malaria because the parasite can't get inside of your blood cells. So this is what we call a heterozygote advantage, because if you are heterozygous, then not only are you not really infected with sickle cell anemia, but you're also not really infected with malaria either. So again, in America, there is no heterozygote advantage here because malaria is not a problem that we have. So there's really no advantage because you're not being faced with these parasitic mosquitoes, and we're not at risk of dying from malaria. But in areas like Africa, where people do die from malaria every day, there's actually a benefit to carrying this sickle cell disease, and that's why it's still a problem today, because those carriers then can pass it on to their offspring. So with all of these things that I've been talking about, and I should have prefaced this earlier, you'll notice that you have 2 versions of a gene. You can have 2 dominant versions of that gene, a dominant and a recessive, or 2 recessive. Anytime you see the prefix di or di, it just means 2. Okay, so in this case, dihybrid, you have 2 different alleles, or diploid, diploid, you can have 2 different alleles, which means you have 2 different versions of a gene. Hopefully that answers that question, Carly. Okay. Any questions about heterozygote advantage? So the reason that the population benefits from heterozygote advantage, besides just these people being able to live longer, is that we have this variation now within our population. So remember, we just talked about how variation is key to natural selection and evolution occurring. We need different genes, we need different versions of traits in order to have a population actually be able to have evolution occurring, or natural selection. And so if you have heterozygotes, then they have these 2 different versions of the trait that they can pass on to their offspring, which leads to a more diverse gene pool.